Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality.
Hello, listeners. This is Fahrusha for Shattered Reality Podcast. We are here on a solemn occasion, which is the anniversary of 9/11. It is September 11th, 2018, and it is again a Tuesday, just like the day in 2001 when the horrific incidents rained down upon New York City and Washington and a field somewhere in Pennsylvania. So we are going to do some talking about 9/11 at the end of our show. But to start out with, we have a wonderful author to talk with today, but I wanted to say first that unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, my co-host and partner in crime here, Kate Valentine, is not here due to unforeseen circumstances beyond her control. She would have loved to speak to our guest, as I hope I will too. And our guest today has a book out, a new book called Time Loops. He is also the author of a very interesting blog called The Nightshirt. And let's welcome Eric Wargo to Shattered Reality. Hi, Eric. How are you doing today?
Hi, Fahrusha. I'm doing great.
Good. So you're speaking to us from Denver, Colorado, avoiding any chance of getting hit with a hurricane here on the East Coast, which looks like is coming down the coast a bit from the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area. It's going to hit somewhere in North Carolina, they tell us.
Yes, doesn't look good. Yeah, I live in Washington, D.C., but taking some couple weeks at my mom's house here in the foothills outside of Denver. It's lovely here, so I'm happy that I'll be missing all the bad weather that's going to hit.
Yes, I'm a little bit envious of people in places where the weather is good, because we've had nothing but constant rain here in the metro area. So, you have had a very, very interesting blog for a while called The Nightshirt. And I have read a number of the blog posts that you have written, but now you have kind of put all your knowledge together into this book called Time Loops. Now, I apologize that I did not mention to start off with that you have a Ph.D. in anthropology from Emory University. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, and I find it interesting that you, in writing about an ESP phenomena called precognition, that you have taken a more physics approach to the subject.
Well, if you're going to write about this subject, you kind of have to deal with the physics. Honestly, the physics part of the book, which I think is probably the most challenging part of the book, and I hope people, if they find it too difficult, we'll just sort of skip past those chapters because it's tough. It's tough stuff, and it's certainly not my what I feel most comfortable with. But I've spent the last few years, really trying to delve into it and understand it to at least a degree. I'm never going to be able to read all those equations and everything. But
well, does anybody totally understand it? Even the people who are studying it, isn't that part of it?
Well, that's just it. And that's actually what's so fascinating about it. The more you get into quantum physics specifically, you realize, well, there are multiple interpretations of what's observed in laboratories. And these interpretations are vastly at odds with each other. So no one understands it really, and they all disagree wildly about what it means. And that to me is fascinating. I'm sort of where I come from as an I'm not an I should say I don't work as an anthropologist. I left academia the moment I got my PhD and I haven't really looked back. But my interest really is in kind of knowledge and how knowledge evolves, and both including scientific knowledge, but also all other sort of domains of knowledge that are sort of part of the larger knowledge ecosystem. And how they all fit together, and how science works, and how science progresses, and so forth. And I think that's been kind of my maybe sort of a little bit unique angle on paranormal subjects that I write about on my blog. I'm kind of trying to look at the paranormal and at parapsychology and ufology and all that as kind of, these are domains of knowledge, and they exist in tension with other domains of knowledge, obviously. And so that in and of itself I find fascinating.
So,
but I don't. Yeah.
So I was going to say, perhaps you would speak to exactly your definition of precognition and retrocausation.
Right.
For the layman, because not everybody here has a PhD in physics, including moi.
Right. Well, including moi. I don't have one either. Okay, precognition is sort of an umbrella term that means pretty much any kind of knowing the future or seeing the future or feeling the future or whatever, being influenced by the future in some way that goes outside the scope of normal perception or inference. So, somehow being able to get insight into a future event or a future experience beyond what would be possible, via ordinary prediction, ordinary inference about the future. Now, under that umbrella term, there are a number of more specific terms that have their own connotations. Like, people are generally familiar with the term premonition. That might be that typically sort of connotes something bad happening in the future and having a dream or a vision or something that seems to foretell something traumatic ahead in time. Then there's the term presentiment, which is a term that covers feeling the future, getting sensations or emotions or somehow being influenced by the future outside of conscious awareness. There are a number of very interesting laboratory experiments in presentiment over the last couple of decades, and I read about those in my book.
Yes, the Darrell Bem exercises particularly, right?
Yes, especially. And Dean Radin has done some marvelous stuff. There's been a number of experimenters doing really interesting work in that area. Now, retrocausation is a more physics term, which means any sort of way in which the future influences the past, or in which, or any kind of situation where an effect precedes its cause in time. Like effects preceding their causes. And this, I argue, and many people argue, is really the necessary sort of condition for something like precognition to exist.
Yeah, and I found it very, very interesting because I think that most people who probably listen to this podcast know about the double slit experiments in physics and the particles going through one slit or the other, and and you can't measure where it is if you want to measure the speed or some such thing like that. But this kind of takes care of that problem in the double slit experiment. Do you want to speak to that in a more intelligent way than I can?
The double slit. I'm sorry. Could you repeat your question?
Well, I'm saying that the theory that you have expounded in your book about retrocausation takes care of the problems with the double slit experiment. Takes it. How can I express
Well,
this?
right. Potentially, it does. There's a school of thought in physics, and this is the one that I sort of focus in on. That I'm sorry, I'm getting a text message here. I have to silence my.
That's okay. That's
Sorry.
okay. It happens.
Yeah. That what has always been seen in these experiments as randomness, okay, quantum randomness. For instance, the double slit experiment is supposedly an effect of unpredictable behavior of light waves interfering with each other. The wave function.
Photons.
Yeah,
Yes.
photons that behave as waves until you observe them. Well, there's another way of looking at this, that instead of matter behaving, wavily until you observe it, which is the usual way it's expressed, there's another way of looking at it, that it's that final measurement is actually exerting a cause backwards. It's actually causing the previous behavior of that photon, and so on back through time, so that what you're really observing in these experiments, like the double slit, is the influence of your final measurement on the previous behavior of the light beam. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And that is sort of the perspective that sort of makes precognition possible.
And that is sort of what is happening on a submolecular level. And then we can extrapolate outwards into, the human world of this size ratio. I don't know if that's followable.
Yeah. Right. The idea would be that on a molecular level, this is occurring on a molecular level, and the brain somehow is able to scale up these effects. Quantum biology is sort of a new frontier in science, just really literally in the last decade. It's been speculated about for half a century, but really it's just in the last little more than a decade that biologists and physicists have actually discovered quantum effects operating in life processes like photosynthesis, for instance, and bird navigation.
Yes.
And this is going to be a big booming field, you can bet, in the next couple decades.
Well, you had mentioned the microtubules inside the synapses of the brain, and in the photosynthesis, some mysterious ways that matter goes past barriers, I believe.
Right. Well, the quantum tunneling is sort of the basis of photosynthesis. It turns out when a photon strikes a molecule inside a plant cell, it releases an electron, and the electron is able to find the fastest path possible to the part of the plant cell that uses that energy and converts it. But another way of looking at it is that the photon already knows where it's going. Its destination has already influenced the path of that electron as it passes through the plant cell, and that this kind of effect is operating inside microtubules in neurons, possibly in all kinds of micro level molecular processes, not only in the brain but throughout the body.
Does this imply consciousness on the part of these very tiny particles?
No, it doesn't. It simply implies teleology, which is the idea that ends sort of influence things that happen before them. That's why you have to start speaking of causality going in both directions.
Right.
And it doesn't. It looks very much as though these particles are conscious, But another way of looking at it is simply that things are determined. Everything that happens is determined both by efficient causation, which is the kind of causation we're used to dealing with in everyday life, sort of billiard balls hitting each other in sequence. But that random component to those billiard balls, hitting each other, what quantum physicists have always sort of lumped under the rubric of uncertainty, the fact that you can't predict how any given particle is going to behave until you measure it. Well, that random component may really reflect retrocausal influence. That random component may really be the influence of the future on the past. And it's very difficult to measure that, because when you make a measurement, you're influencing what you're measuring. And so it's very hard to tease apart what is an effect of what you've done versus what the future is doing. But there are increasingly sophisticated quantum measurement tools that are enabling people to discern these retrocausal influences. And so it's not a universally accepted paradigm in physics. Like I said, quantum physicists disagree wildly about how to interpret, the double slit experiment and so on. But one very interesting interpretation that's gaining ground is that is this retrocausal interpretation. And if you read the science news, every month there's a new article showing how quantum systems, how like quantum computers can scramble, cause and effect, and how, their retrocausation is becoming a big thing.
Well, it's certainly the whole field of quantum computing is something that I think is going to be really big in our immediate future. I think it's coming into existence now, and it's beginning to be used. And I'm certainly not an expert or even very conversant on quantum computing, but I've read quite a bit about it, and it looks like it has great potential. But for most of our listeners, we need to bring it into the human realm. So, therefore, I would ask you if you are acquainted with one Marty Rosenblatt, who was a guest on Shattered Reality.
I am not.
Okay, Marty Rosenblatt is a person who studies remote viewing. He is fairly prominent in the remote viewing community. And unlike many of the remote viewers, he's not a former government remote viewer. So there is no aspect of military or defense agencies or anything like that involved with Marty that I know of anyway. In any case, he runs as an ARVAPP, which is Applied Precognition Project. ARV is Associative Remote Viewing. And I belong to that group. And what we do is just really intimately involved with precognition and retrocausation, because we do a remote viewing session where we only have 6 numbers to go on. The 6 numbers correspond to nothing in particular in the real world. And we take whatever amount of time it is to make a drawing. And then 2 photos are revealed to those folks who submit a drawing and maybe some words. You get, what do you smell? What do you feel? What do you taste? What does it look like? Okay, and you draw that up. And after you draw that up, you get to see 2 photographs. And you decide if your drawing corresponds to either of those 2 photographs. And then you pick that photograph and you sort of score your drawing. Like your drawing might have 1 element of photograph B, but 10 elements of photograph A. So then you give yourself a score and you say, I'm going to go with photograph A. Then it is assigned to a sports betting situation of over-under. Are you familiar with over-under in sports betting?
I know nothing about sports betting.
Neither did I. Because sports have absolutely no interest to me. That sounds very close-minded, but, football, soccer, Hockey, I don't care if they never do it again. Baseball and basketball are kind of nice, I suppose, if you like that stuff. I don't. Uh, but over-under is basically, it's a number that the bookies come up with, the people who make the odds. And in a baseball game, it turns out to be the total numbers scored, the total number of runs scored in the game, what's expected. Now, that's usually between, like, say, 7 and 10. And the bookies put up the odds. Now, when we make these drawings, we have no idea what game it's involving, if it's football or whatever is in season. It's a major league sport. And so one of the photographs corresponds to over, one of the photographs corresponds to under. And so we get to bet on the group, what the group has decided. So if there are 10 people, shall we say, in a particular remote viewing group, and it comes out that many more people voted for over, and there's some kind of statistical way I'm definitely not going into on the podcast because I couldn't speak to it that well to begin with, but that picture A represents over, and so the people who want to bet put their money on over, and they then win or lose, and he's got very, very, very good odds coming back. A lot of people are winning. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how you're supposed to do it is you're supposed to act very happy, be very pleased when you see the winning photograph, and that's supposed to be excite you enough in the future that retrocausally you'll pick up the right stuff in the present.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, go ahead. I mean, there is a school of thought that is how all remote viewing may work, that you're actually precognizing the feedback that you're going to get and your own excitement about the feedback. It's a very interesting, it's not the most mainstream interpretation of remote viewing, but it's a very interesting one. And yes, associative remote viewing is fascinating and, has a lot of potential, I think.
Absolutely. So I was just trying to bring retrocausality into the current human scale. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about something you mentioned frequently in the book, which is a Dunne dream, D-U-N-N-E, referring to a gentleman named Dunne.
Yes. John William Dunne, J.W.Dunne, was an aeronautical engineer in about a century ago. Around the turn of the century, actually, and about a century ago, he published a book on his precognitive dreams. He had experienced precognitive dreams all his life, and he'd experienced these dreams. And he thought they were precognitive, but he couldn't make sense of them. And he was an engineer. He was very kind of rigorous in his thinking, and he wanted to figure out what was going on. And so he realized he needed to actually record them. And kind of be scientific about it. Now, it's not his investigation is not anything that a hard-headed scientist would probably consider valid, because when you're recording your own dreams, interpreting your own dreams, there's a lot of subjective bias there. But nevertheless, he recorded quite a large number of dreams that corresponded to learning experiences generally, or just very exciting experiences in his life, typically often within a few days. Not always. Sometimes there was a longer time delay, but often it was a few days later. And often they weren't, really hugely significant things. They were often just news stories. Maybe they were news stories about some disaster or some tragedy happening somewhere remotely. Or they were just exciting in some way or another. And in any case, he published a book in 1927, called An Experiment with Time. And it's a classic in parapsychology. And it's really a remarkable sort of study. He had a very sort of forensic approach to this. I mean, he really teased apart his dreams and the events that they seemed to refer to. And his great discovery which I'm trying to return to in my book, because I feel like it's an interpretation of these phenomena that has never really received enough attention. His great discovery was that his dreams didn't refer to future events in objective reality. They referred to his own learning about those events. So let me give you an example. This is probably the most famous example. It's often quoted from his book, but he was on maneuvers with the British armed forces in South Africa in, I think, 1900, and he was camped out with his regiment, and he had a dream about being on an island, a volcanic island that was about to blow. And he was then trying to convince the French authorities of this island that there was this volcano was about to blow and that 4,000 people were about to die. And the number 4,000 kept coming up in the dream. Well, he woke up, and I don't know how many days later, a batch of mail arrived in their regiment, and included in the mail was the latest issue of the newspaper. I forget what newspaper it was. And, the headline in the newspaper was that Mont Pelée on the island of Martinique had exploded, killing 40,000 people.
Wow. Yeah.
So he was off by, one digit, in his number, but, he thought, well, gee, that's pretty amazing. And that was one of the early dreams that really led him to kind of be more scientific about his study. But the crucial fact in this dream is that the actual number killed was something, it turned out to be roughly 30-some thousand. It was not related to the either 4,000 or 40,000. So it was clear that he was not precognizing an actual volcanic eruption. He was precognizing his own reading the newspaper about volcanic eruption. And it's an exciting reading experience. It's like, any learning about any disaster is a very, it's emotionally salient, or it's unsettling in various ways. He had other experiences that were similar, where he was able to kind of tease apart what it was he was actually precognizing. And in all cases, he was not precognizing some event in some generalized future. He wasn't precognizing the future. He wasn't seeing the future, as we would typically put it. He was getting a preview, some kind of mental preview of his own future reading experiences, basically, or just a future emotional upheavals, I guess. And, that, right there would be almost a good segue to talking about 9/11, because, of course, many people had Dunne dreams, predicting 9/11. I myself had a Dunne dream predicting 9/11.
Could you tell us of your Dunne dream?
I sure could. And it's not anything, super spectacular. And in my case, it wasn't a literal vision of planes crashing into towers or anything like that. But I did, I woke up on that morning probably about 6:30 in the morning or 7 in the morning. And as I always do, I always try to write down just a few notes about the dreams that I remember, because generally later in the morning when I have more time, I will type them up in a dream journal on my computer. In this case, I just jotted down notes that I had I was driving down a neighborhood in my hometown when I was a child, Denver, Colorado, and I drove past two identical, perfectly square mosques that had very bland corrugated facades. In fact, I think the word I used was corduroy. It just had this very drab corduroy gray effect, and that was really all I could remember of the dream. And I didn't even go back to the dream until I think the next day. I noticed my notes about this dream. I thought, oh, that's weird. I've never in my life, dreamed about mosques or anything to do with Islam or whatever. And in fact, I did later. I did do a word check of my of my dream journals and found that there's nowhere else in my 25 years of recording my dreams.
Oh my goodness.
have I dreamed about anything to do with Islam or Muslims or mosques or anything like that? And one of the interesting details about this dream is the location where this occurred. With any dream, you need to sort of free associate on all the elements of the dream. Everything you notice in a dream, it will be kind of part of a larger rebus or hieroglyph. And the place where these mosques were situated happened to be, in real life, a place where my father, when I was a kid, had briefly had his clinical psychology practice. It was like a little medical building. And it was just, I think, even less than a year that he had his practice in this building. And I had one association with his time at that practice, which was being called late at night, kind of on an emergency call to see a client of his who is having a suicidal crisis, a suicidal breakdown. And he even, kind of inappropriately, I realize in hindsight, he kind of told us about this afterwards. But this client, and I remember him describing...
No HIPAA laws then. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Apparently not, or else he was just flagrantly violating them. But I remember him telling us, because I think he didn't know how to really deal with it, but this male client of his was wearing a dress and was crying in tears. And clearly this male client, I believe, was what we would now call transgender, was, this was in the 1970s, but, that term I don't think existed back then. But, I think this client wanted a sex change or something, and he was, but going through some sort of suicidal crisis. So I had one mental association with this location where these mosques were in my dream, which was A, suicide, and two, what we could call emasculation.
Yes, I was just thinking of that word. I knew you were going to say that. Precognition. Right. I knew you were going to use that word. Maybe because of your psychological background and the whole business with Freud in your book, but I knew you were going to go to that.
Well, exactly. And I'm steeped in Freud. I have been for many decades. So that's just sort of that's what the associations my brain makes. They're not necessarily the associations that someone else's brain would make. But the point is, for me, I had these associations with emasculation, sort of castration and suicide for the location of these identical gray mosques. And so...
and they do exist in reality, these gray mosques.
No, they don't.
They don't exist at all.
That's just it. They were situated in my dream, where in real life there was a medical building that my father had his practice at that time, but they were substituted. This often happens in dreams, in fact, and this is a really handy tool of dream interpretation. Dreams often transpire in sort of a known geography, from a familiar geography, but there are details that are transposed or changed, and those transpositions or those changes, those are meaningful elements in the dream.
Yes, and there was displacement that, this was about what happened on the East Coast, but it was displaced into this other reality that perhaps was more familiar to you.
Well, I think it was just the symbolism of it, the idea of, that there were, the salient things that came through from that day. Anyone watching, transfixed by the news that day. First of all, there was almost immediately there was chatter that this had been perpetrated by Islamic terrorists, that had been perpetrated by Al Qaeda. That was almost immediately the assumption was, and for many people, many Americans like me, this is really the first time we'd even been. This was the first time that Islam was even on our radar. We just hadn't thought about Islam and Islamic terrorism and things like that really that much until that day. And for many Americans like me, it's like all of a sudden we were very afraid of this whole this whole phenomenon. And so that was a very emotionally salient detail of the news chatter that day. And the obvious fact that these were suicide attacks.
Yes.
and that it was such an emasculating. I mean, the immediate thing when you see those towers falling, that this is these terrorists had castrated or emasculated our country. So I would say that was those highly salient elements of that news reporting of that day sort of came through and were turned in my own brain into that particular image. And I think every person would dream differently about an event like that.
And we are planning at the end of our podcast to reveal some of the premonitions that our listeners had about 9/11 at the time, and maybe immediately before, and some interesting events that had happened directly thereafter. But that is a very interesting dream, and it's interesting that you have been so assiduously recording your dreams for such a long amount of time. I fall in and out of it myself. I do it. What do you attribute that some people could have the same dreams or interlocking dreams, one with the other, people who are acquaintances but are perhaps, not lovers, not best friends, whatever, where people will dream about the same events that are dream events, not events in 4D?
I have to say that's not a phenomenon I'm that familiar with, so I wouldn't want to speculate about that. I mean, certainly a lot of people would, think telepathy, something like that. My hunch is that people who are intimate or who are friends and who share their dreams, you could potentially be precognizing each other's telling you their dreams. They're revealing of the dreams. So there's that possibility. I wouldn't want to speculate more without a specific instance, but by and large, I'm very much. I am sort of a Freudian at heart.
I figured that out.
Yeah. Well, not that there aren't problems with Freud. There certainly are, but I do. I think that people do. Their dream language is very unique and very personal because it comes from our personal associations, our life associations. I mean, no one else, is going to dream about that particular location in Lakewood, Colorado, because no one else's dad was a doctor there, in 1976 or whatever it was. It's like it's our own unique life experiences that give us our dream language.
Well, the places, I mean, just off the top of my head, the places where I see pushback on your book are probably some of the Freudian stuff, because I think that it doesn't quite ring as true for women, though I don't see it as being untrue, like absolutely untrue. On the other hand, juxtaposing retrocausality with the Oedipus thing, it's an interesting read, but I think that to women it's not going to ring as true as it is to men. And that's sort of a vague criticism, and it's not meant to be a negative criticism, just that that's somewhere where I see you getting pushback. I also see pushback from parapsychologists who don't want to see every parapsychological occurrence as being like a retrocausal occurrence, although a lot of them can be seen in that light. And the third thing is you apparently give me the impression that you are a physicalist or a materialist in terms of your philosophy, whereas many people in parapsychology are philosophical idealists. So I'm probably going in over not over the head, but over the thinking, immediate thinking thoughts of our listeners with those statements. But maybe you want to speak a little bit to the idea of physicalism and consciousness, and how you feel that consciousness works with retrocausality and why you think that consciousness might be an emergent property of the brain.
Well, I don't say that actually. And I don't.
Okay.
I
took away the wrong thing then.
Well, no, you're right that I am trying to. I wouldn't call. I guess I would call myself. I don't know if I would call myself a materialist. I'm sort of. I'm trying to straddle two worlds with this book a little bit. I am trying to address a larger audience, I think, of readers who are going to be coming at this sort of with a natural materialist or physicalist bent. I think most people who are not in parapsychology or sort of on the margins of mainstream science, they come in with materialist assumptions, and I'm trying to speak to that audience by saying, look, there's no reason that these phenomena can't be material in nature. I believe quantum physics is a materialist science. I mean, it's a study of matter. Now, what matter is, deep down, is it just math? Is it just ideas? Who knows? I think that there are ways that you can link these languages up.
I would agree and disagree with that at the same time. I think that quantum physics, from my point of view, came out of the physical sciences as a way to describe the actions of subatomic particles. But if you read some of the writings of the quantum physicists, I'm trying to think of an exact example, but they ended up, many of them, not being materialists.
It's not that simple, and
okay.
I know the examples you're thinking of, and I'm not thinking of the names either. There's the famous quotes, comes back to consciousness and so forth. John von Neumann is an example of someone who thought that it's his interpretation that it was consciousness itself that collapses the wave function, for instance. But that's not a mainstream view, and I think when you're saying quantum physicists, you have to.
Max von Planck, I guess, was the one that I was thinking about. But
right.
I
actually.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I'm certainly. I am not making any claims about consciousness or its relation to materiality, and I think that I do argue in the book that we don't need to figure that out to understand precognition, that it is possible to address precognition without making any big claims about what consciousness is or how it relates to the physical world. That it may be a little bit simpler than that, actually.
Between you and me and the wall, I don't think that any of us are going to figure this out.
That's exactly it. I mean, we're good luck figuring out consciousness and having some final answer to consciousness, in our lifetimes. I just don't think. I think these are ongoing philosophical questions that are going to be troubling humans for millennia. So, and I think that we can make a lot of progress without answering those questions. And so that's where I'm coming from.
And I didn't mean to make things difficult for you. It just, I read the book and I found myself rereading certain parts of it so that I could understand some of the more physics things. And I think that all our listeners would love to read the book and all the examples that you have given from recent historical. By recent, I mean the last 150 years or so. Not too much that goes back into ancient times, because we can't know really, in my mind, what people were thinking exactly back then. But we can have a really pretty good idea about what Freud was talking about or what Dunne was talking about. So I think that your book is really a tour de force of this precognitive quality. And I really want to thank you for having been on Shattered Reality today.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
And I hope you'll come back and talk with us again, perhaps when Kate is here as well.
I'd love to. That would be great. There's so much to say about this. It's a huge topic.
It is. And again, I didn't mean to give you a hard time at all, but I think that this is where you are going to get some pushback. And I thought, heck, might as
well, I hope people, as far as the Freud stuff, I hope they realize, I'm using the term Oedipus kind of tongue in cheek here. I'm not a big believer in the Oedipus complex, but Freud did have a lot of sort of silly ideas, but it's interesting when you look at him as a precog, and then you look at all the evidence of precognition and psychoanalysis.
Well, you got me thinking about what kind of an example, just as Oedipus is an example for Freud, what kind of an example I would find for women's sexuality. And I came to think of the book Wuthering Heights. And you actually gave me an idea for a blog post of my own. So I want to thank you about that.
Oh, well, definitely let me know when I'd love to read that.
Yeah, it'd probably be pretty wacky and not as nearly as astute as your opus there, the wonderful book. Why don't you tell us the book and where it can be gotten, and mention it all again so you can have a little boost here?
Sure. Yeah, the book is Time Loops. Subtitle is Precognition, Retrocausation, and the Unconscious. My name is Eric Wargo. That's Wargo. And that book can be purchased on Amazon, of course, or any online bookseller, Barnes & Noble, etc. And it's from Anomalist Books, an excellent publisher. And also check out my blog, The Nightshirt. It's all one word, thenightshirt.com.
And it is great stuff. And it's stuff that I say absolutely works. I'm a person who does associative remote viewing, and retrocausality absolutely works. So that's the best plug that I can give for it, that it works in my life. Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you. This has been fun.
Okay, so here we are at Shattered Reality. It is September 11th, 2018, and we are going to do a little bit of a review. I had asked our listeners to send in experiences that they had for their precognition of 9/11, and it's a very sensitive subject. Our listeners had a number of precognitive 9/11 experiences to share, starting with the most prosaic, the one that just about everyone in the New York area can resonate with. Our listener, Mark, who is a commercial artist, worked with a woman whose husband overslept on that fateful morning, and when his later bus was about to enter the tunnel, it was turned back. He was a worker at one of the towers, and oversleeping on that day saved his life. So that we can't say what caused him to oversleep, what caused him to dawdle going to get the bus, but he, in fact, was saved in that manner. And like I said, most everybody in the New York area has a story like that to relate. Now, similarly, a female client of mine played hooky from work that day, saving her life, but causing her to feel guilt for years to come, knowing that many of her coworkers died. We have a listener who has reported other psychic experiences in her life. That listener is Nurse Nancy, who was working in a hospital for the criminally insane in the late 1990s. One Hispanic inmate who was a practitioner of some of the darker arts, some of the darker voodoo and Santeria kind of practitioner, this inmate, she frequently conversed with this man and found him very interesting. And he told her that he had stopped going to Manhattan, stopped going to New York City due to what he felt were prophetic dreams of horror about Manhattan. He repeatedly dreamt of planes buzzing perilously low overhead, people screaming, and pieces of partially burnt paper falling from above. The dreams filled him with such dread he could not go into the city anymore. Now, this happened in the late 90s, so it was well ahead of 9/11, several years. Now, we have a very nice letter from Maxine in Australia, and Maxine wrote the following. Hi, Fahrusha. Here's my story. I hope you find it interesting. A couple of days prior to the World Trade Center attack, I had a dream that I believe picked up on the event that was about to happen. I wish I could do this in an Australian accent, but I can't. It's not an accurate premonition, but I feel that enough elements fit to make it interesting. No proof, of course, just my memory of the experience. At the time, I worked in a small office tower of about 12 stories located in southeast Queensland in Australia. Beside that building was another one of similar size. Nothing like the size of the WTC, but similar in that they were two buildings side by side. They were surrounded by much smaller buildings, 1 or 2 stories in height, but no other taller buildings for some distance. In my dream, I was standing on the street 1 block away, looking across and up at the 2 buildings. I then saw a metal object slice diagonally into one of the buildings, chunking into the glass and building frame. The damage was positioned at about halfway to 2/3 of the building height. There was no plane, but I thought that the object was attached to a long extended metal arm reaching up from a truck. It seemed to be a concrete pumping or firefighting style truck. This is obviously not correct to the New York event, but the actual damage to the building looked very similar to the damage when the first plane hit the World Trade Center. Also, a truck would not have been large enough to reach up to the building as I saw it in my dream. Maybe the idea of a fire truck with an extended arm adds some weight to the story. In summary, I had a dream about an exterior object chunking into the side of a building that was one of a pair of similar buildings. The dream was just before the World Trade Center attack. As I said, no way an exact foreseeing of what did transpire, but the elements feel more than coincidental. Also, that dream was very vivid, and I remembered it very clearly, and that memory has never left me, even after all these years. My geographic location on the other side of the world just shows that physical distance is of no consequence in these matters. Well, that's it. And she says she didn't want to talk on the air, and she says she loves the podcast, and we love you too, Maxine. Thanks so much for that revelation. I think that her story is a perfect example of foreseeing what was coming, but the mind displacing the event towards the familiar, similar to what Eric Wargo had told us about his premonition, seeing those 2 mosques in downtown Colorado, Denver there. So, in a similar vein, we have Suzanne Evans Morris, a Ph.D. in speech and language pathology, and a very astute woman who I have had the pleasure of meeting on several occasions. She writes thus: I was traveling from Wisconsin to Virginia and spent the night at a hotel in Moorhead, Kentucky, the night of September 10th. I typically sleep very well on these trips, especially after a long day of driving. However, that night I woke up around 2 a.m. and felt very agitated and unsettled. I had trouble getting back to sleep. I woke up around 8:45, again feeling anxious and somewhat agitated. The first thing I did was turn on the television, just as the second plane hit the World Trade Center. This was very unusual for me. I rarely watch television while I'm traveling. I would never turn it on immediately after awakening. I just don't want to begin my day with the negativity of most of the news on broadcast television. However, that morning, I didn't even think. I just went over and turned on the TV. I know that I was picking up something in our vibrational universe that related to the attacks of the morning of 9/11. These kinds of clear precognitive events are not common for me. And she says, love and peace to you, Suzanne. I thank her for that. Now we have another slightly different sort of, it's not a premonition, it's an observation. It's a psychic observation by Greg, who is a very intuitive man. He lets us in on something he perceived at a 9/11 memorial in 2014. I have been physically to the memorial site in New York City. It is a powerful place, and as with other memorial sites, such as the Vietnam Wall, I always get overwhelmed by the energy. I've also watched as survivors or family or friends pull in those that they've lost back to the memorial sites. I suspect this happens at other such powerful places around the globe. Sometime before the 13th anniversary of the 9/11 event, I was asked by a friend to check the memorial site. My friend was concerned because another friend of his sensed that something was going to happen on the anniversary, a terrorist attack or other criminal event at the memorial. I assured my friend that I didn't think anything would happen, as the area is heavily protected, both physically as well as energetically. I checked the site, and sure enough, although there were whispers of a desire to cause distress at the site, it was too protected for anything to happen. On the day of the 13th anniversary, I decided to travel, astral travel, and visit the site. As I stood in the crowd observing the friends and families mourn their loved ones, I noticed an agitated young man searching the crowd. He was dressed in the full New York City fireman's regalia: boots, baggy fire pants with the fluorescent strips, the jacket, the fire hat, other gear that you see firemen wear as they head into a building. He wove through the crowd looking for a woman, a young woman, his wife or girlfriend, his beloved. For a brief moment, he caught me looking at him, but he wouldn't acknowledge me or my offer of help. I always ask how long someone has passed before I reach out. Helps me to know if I'll, quote, see a human form, or as most often happens, pure energy form, especially if the person has been out of body for some time. We tend to keep the human form for just a brief time after passing. Not sure why. Yet powerful places such as memorials often pull souls back in human form years after their passing. The strong physical presence of the young fireman, though, was very striking. He wasn't at all as transparent as others in the crowd were. I sensed from him that it was because he wasn't yet ready to give up on his last life, his dreams of a loving relationship with the young woman he was searching for, their plans for a house, the children they had talked about having. He was unwilling to end these dreams and move on. Why? I suspect he wouldn't acknowledge me or come near me. I left very soon after, and I haven't been back to check on him. I wonder, after 13 years, the young woman had moved on with her life, yet for the young fireman, his healing would take some time. I myself had some premonitions of 9/11. At that time, I would ordinarily take a plane to Europe during the summer, but I felt like there was something negative in the air and I didn't want to travel to Europe. So instead, I traveled to Las Vegas. And unfortunately, there were some disruptive, young, Arabic-looking men on the flight, and they gave me pause for thought during that flight. Nothing happened, I'm happy to say, and I got off the plane in Las Vegas and proceeded to have a very nice time. That was in August. September 9th of that year, I went out with a friend for a birthday dinner, and when I came back to my apartment, I had a terrible nightmare early in the evening, and it may have been occasioned by the fact that there may have been helicopters flying over my building, but I woke up screaming and said, "They're coming to get us." Then on the date of September 10th, a Monday, I recall going out into the street and feeling like things were too quiet. The day was too perfect. Kids had just started back to school, and the day was just too quiet. Something was up. I didn't know what. I had no idea what. But I was supposed to work for the Green Party candidate at a polling place. I think it was in Brooklyn that morning of 9/11, and I conveniently overslept, which is not something that I would ordinarily do. I usually go to my appointments in a timely manner, but I couldn't sleep that night. And I did not go to the polling place where I was supposed to be representing one of the Green Party candidates. And so I avoided getting bound up in the subways and left in Brooklyn, or possibly something worse happening to me. So I'm very thankful about that. It's a very difficult day for those of us here in the greater New York area because almost everybody knows someone who was lost. Without further ado, I am going to say goodbye to our listeners on this very solemn Memorial Day of 9/11. Goodbye from shattered reality.